I spent much of my professional life measuring power the hard way through logistics, production capacity, resilience under pressure, and the willingness of societies to endure sacrifice. Real power is never abstract. It lives in factories, in supply lines, in energy flows, and in the credibility of institutions when stress is applied. Yet somewhere after the Cold War, the United States convinced itself that economic supremacy was no longer something to be defended through strategy. It was assumed, treated as destiny rather than as a condition that could erode, fracture, or be deliberately challenged. Washington began to confuse financial dominance with national strength. The dollar's reserve status, Wall Street's scale, and the reach of American capital markets were mistaken for substitutes for industrial capacity and strategic discipline. We outsourced production, hollowed out manufacturing, and allowed critical supply chains to migrate offshore, all while reassuring ourselves that markets would self-correct and that efficiency was synonymous with security. As a military man, I find that logic deeply familiar and deeply flawed. Armies that optimize for efficiency rather than resilience break first when the shooting starts. China watched this transformation closely. While American policymakers celebrated balance sheets and quarterly returns, Beijing invested in physical reality ports, refineries, smelters, shipyards, semiconductor fabs, and logistics corridors. This was not accidental. It was strategic. Power, after all, accrues to those who control production, not merely pricing. But in the West, the belief took hold that economic gravity could never shift, that the rules we wrote would bind everyone else forever, and that any challenger would eventually bend to the system. That belief was not analyzed. It was ideology. And like all ideologies, it dulled intelligence assessments and punished dissent. Warnings about deindustrialization were dismissed as nostalgia. Concerns about supply chain vulnerability were labeled protectionism. The assumption was simple. If trouble emerged, markets would stabilize it, sanctions would correct it, and financial leverage would enforce compliance. History teaches a harsher lesson. When nations stop grounding power in material reality, they begin to confuse comfort with strength. The illusion of economic supremacy did not collapse overnight. It cracked quietly, year by year, hidden behind rising asset prices and political slogans. By the time the stress test arrived, the foundation was already compromised. When I look at how China approached its relationship with the United States, I don't see improvisation or opportunism. I see patience. I see a strategic culture that understands time as a weapon and interdependence as terrain. While Washington framed globalization as a benign, self-regulating force, Beijing treated it as an operational environment, one that could be shaped, penetrated, and ultimately controlled. This difference in mindset matters. One side believed markets would neutralize rivalry. The other understood that markets could be disciplined to serve national power. China did not challenge the U.S.-led economic order head-on. That would have been reckless. Instead, it embedded itself within it, absorbing technology, capital, and industrial know-how, while quietly shifting the balance of production. Supply chains became the decisive ground. Rare earth processing, pharmaceuticals, electronics, assembly, shipping capacity, and industrial inputs were consolidated under Chinese control, not because of efficiency alone, but because control itself was the objective. Dependency was not an accident. It was the point. In military terms, this is classic shaping of the battlefield before contact. By the time Washington began talking seriously about strategic competition, the terrain was already compromised. American corporations depended on Chinese manufacturing. Allied economies were tied to Chinese logistics. Even U.S. defense production relied on materials processed or sourced through China. Interdependence had ceased to be mutual. It had become asymmetrical. What made the strategy effective was Western denial. Any suggestion that China might exploit economic ties for strategic leverage was dismissed as paranoia. Engagement was treated as irreversible progress, and every warning sign was waved away with the promise that prosperity would liberalize behavior. I have heard this logic before in arms control debates, in counterinsurgency planning, in wars where assumptions replaced verification. It always ends the same way. China never hid its priorities, Industrial policy was explicit. State coordination was overt. Long-term planning documents spoke openly about self-sufficiency, technological sovereignty, and national rejuvenation. The West saw these signals and chose not to interpret them. Intelligence without comprehension is just noise. By the time the United States recognized that interdependence could be weaponized, the leverage had already shifted. You cannot threaten to sever ties when you are the one who cannot function without them. That is not deterrence, that is exposure. And exposure, once revealed, invites pressure. When the Trump administration launched its offensive against China's semiconductor sector, it framed the move as strategic brilliance, a decisive strike against the technological heart of a rising rival. From the outside, it sounded tough. From the inside, it revealed a profound misunderstanding of how power actually works in complex systems. I've seen this before in military planning, a fixation on a single high-value target, divorced from the ecosystem that sustains it. Semiconductors are not weapon systems you can embargo into submission. They are products of sprawling, multinational supply networks involving design, fabrication, tooling, materials, logistics, and human capital spread across dozens of jurisdictions. The United States controlled some nodes, particularly advanced chip design and key manufacturing equipment, but it did not control the system. Strategy requires knowing the difference between influence and dominance. Washington chose to pretend they were the same. Export controls, entity lists, and tariff regimes were deployed as if they were precision-guided munitions. In reality, they functioned more like area bombardment, disruptive, politically satisfying, and strategically sloppy. China responded not with capitulation, but with mobilization. State funding surged into domestic chip development. Talent was repatriated. Parallel supply chains were accelerated. The pressure did not stop China's progress. It clarified its priorities. What Washington failed to grasp was that coercion works only when the target lacks alternatives and time. China had both. The U.S. approach compressed its own window of advantage while granting Beijing strategic clarity. In military terms, it was an unforced error, provoking an adversary to harden precisely the capabilities you claim to fear. There was also an allied dimension that was ignored. Semiconductor production depends heavily on partners Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and the Netherlands. Treating this network as an extension of U.S. sovereign power was a fantasy. Allies complied selectively, hedged quietly, and planned for a future in which American policy volatility was itself a risk factor. Deterrence erodes when predictability disappears. Most telling was the domestic contradiction. The United States attempted to punish China for industrial policy while having dismantled its own. You cannot sanction your way out of strategic neglect. Chips became a symbol not of strength, but of the gap between rhetoric and capacity. The chip war was sold as a show of force. In reality, it was an admission of vulnerability, an acknowledgement that the long game had already been lost. In war, the first serious engagement is rarely decisive, but it is always revealing. You learn what holds under pressure and what was held together by assumption alone. When economic confrontation between the United States and China moved from rhetoric to action, financial markets became the battlefield where those assumptions were tested. And like many battlefields I've studied, it exposed weaknesses long ignored by those who believed air superiority guaranteed victory. American markets had been conditioned to expect insulation from consequence. Decades of monetary intervention, debt expansion, and crisis management created the belief that volatility could always be contained. But markets are not loyal. They respond to structure, not slogans. When supply chains fractured, when export controls disrupted earnings forecasts, and when geopolitical risk became systemic rather than episodic, confidence eroded rapidly. Capital does not debate ideology. It moves. China did not need to attack U.S. markets directly. Structural exposure did the work. Reduced access to Chinese manufacturing raised costs across American industry. Retaliatory measures targeted politically sensitive sectors. Global investors began to reassess risk models built on uninterrupted U.S.-China integration. The result was not collapse, but instability. And instability is how crises begin. In military terms, it was the loss of initiative. What made the situation dangerous was the layering of stress. Equity markets were already inflated by years of cheap credit. Bond markets were distorted by central bank intervention. Corporate debt levels were historically high. When geopolitical shock entered this environment, it amplified every existing fault line. This is how systems fail, not from a single blow, but from cumulative strain. Washington responded, as it always does, with reassurance. Officials spoke of resilience, of strong fundamentals, of temporary disruption. I recognize this language. It is what commanders use when they fear morale more than truth. But markets, unlike troops, do not respond to speeches. They respond to balance sheets, exposure, and credibility. The deeper problem was strategic blindness. By treating markets as separate from national security, policymakers ignored how financial systems transmit pressure faster than any military operation. Once trust wavers, contagion spreads, liquidity dries up. Hedging becomes hoarding. Stability becomes the exception, not the rule. Markets had become battlefields not because China wanted war, but because the United States failed to recognize that economic conflict is still conflict, and conflict always produces casualties. When people begin to abandon abstractions and reach for something they can hold in their hands, it tells you more than any press release ever could. I have watched this instinct surface in war zones and collapsing states alike. It is not driven by panic at first, but by intuition, the quiet recognition that systems built on confidence alone are only as strong as the belief sustaining them. The surge in silver demand in the United States was not irrational behavior. It was an intelligence signal. Silver occupies a peculiar place in economic psychology. It is both an industrial metal and a monetary relic, tied to manufacturing reality while still anchored in historical memory as a store of value. When stress enters financial systems, silver becomes a bridge between fear and function. Rising demand did not indicate obsession with apocalypse. It indicated doubt in liquidity, in currency management, and in the ability of institutions to absorb shock without consequence. Washington and much of the financial press treated the phenomenon as a curiosity, even a nuisance. Shortages were blamed on retail speculation. Volatility was dismissed as social media distortion. But I've learned that when leadership trivializes behavior it does not understand, it usually means it has lost the plot. People do not line up for physical assets because they are bored. They do it because trust is thinning. This was not about silver itself. It was about what silver represented, an exit from financial abstraction. Years of monetary expansion had inflated asset prices while eroding confidence in the underlying discipline of fiscal management. Add geopolitical stress, supply chain disruption, and rising debt servicing costs, and the psychological threshold was crossed. The question shifted from how much can I earn to what will still hold value if this breaks. In military analysis, we treat such behavior as early warning. You don't wait for collapse to take movement seriously. You ask why the population is repositioning before orders are given. The silver panic was exactly that, a civilian redeployment in response to perceived instability. No tanks, no sirens, just choices made quietly at scale. The real failure was not the rush into precious metals. The failure was leadership's refusal to read the signal. Dismissing symptoms does not cure the disease. It ensures it progresses unnoticed. By the time authorities acknowledged that trust was fraying, they were already reacting, not shaping outcomes. Silver did not cause the crisis. It revealed it. In intelligence work, the most dangerous failure is not the absence of information, but the refusal to accept what the information is telling you. I watched this dynamic unfold repeatedly in my career, from weapons inspections to war planning, and I recognize it clearly in how the United States approached its economic confrontation with China. Facts were available, indicators were flashing, but ideology intervened, and intelligence was bent to fit policy rather than the other way around. American leadership across administrations clung to a set of beliefs that no longer matched reality, that the U.S. could dictate economic outcomes through pressure alone, that allies would automatically align regardless of cost, and that China would ultimately prioritize access to Western markets over sovereign capability. These were assumptions, not assessments. They were comforting, politically useful, and strategically corrosive. Ideology framed China as a rule breaker to be disciplined rather than a peer competitor to be understood. This framing narrowed the analytical aperture. Instead of asking how China converts pressure into acceleration, Washington asked only how to increase pressure. Instead of evaluating second and third order effects, policymakers focused on signaling resolve. I've seen this before in military campaigns where force was substituted for strategy and escalation was mistaken for control. What suffered most was honest analysis. Analysts who warned that sanctions could backfire, that decoupling would raise domestic costs, or that financial weaponization would erode trust in the dollar were sidelined or ignored. Intelligence that complicates policy is often treated as disloyalty, but wars and economic wars are no different, are lost precisely when leaders punish realism. The result was strategic tunnel vision. Each new measure was judged by its political optics rather than its systemic impact. When markets reacted negatively, the response was denial. When allies hesitated, the response was pressure. When China adapted, the response was escalation. This is not strategic thinking, it is reflex. In military doctrine, adaptability is survival. Ideology resists adaptation because it demands consistency over correctness. By the time U.S. leadership began acknowledging that their tools were losing effectiveness, credibility had already been spent. Trust eroded abroad and at home, leaving fewer options and higher risks. When intelligence is forced to serve belief, reality does not change. It simply waits. And when it finally asserts itself, it does so without regard for political convenience. Every crisis carries within it a record of decisions made long before the damage becomes visible. By the time consequences arrive, the opportunity for prevention is already past. What unfolded between the United States and China was not an unavoidable collision between rival powers. It was a manufactured crisis born from denial, sustained by hubris, and aggravated by the refusal to confront limits. As a soldier and an analyst, I have learned that denial is not passive. It is an action, and it carries a cost. The United States did not lose ground because China outwitted it tactically. It lost ground because it abandoned strategic realism. Economic power was treated as symbolism rather than structure. Markets were mistaken for instruments of control instead of reflections of confidence. Coercive tools were deployed without regard for resilience, adaptability, or blowback. When those tools failed to produce submission, leaders doubled down rather than reassessing. This is how bad strategies persist through repetition mistaken for resolve. The lesson is not that competition with China was wrong. Competition is inevitable. The lesson is that competition without honesty is self-defeating. You cannot decouple after dependency is entrenched. You cannot rebuild an industry on press releases. You cannot weaponize finance indefinitely without degrading the system that gives it power. And you cannot lecture the world about stability while engineering instability at home. In military history, defeat often follows the same pattern. Commanders ignore logistics, underestimate the adversary, overestimate morale, and suppress dissenting analysis. The battlefield eventually corrects these errors. Economics is no different. Reality asserts itself through shortages, volatility, capital flight, and public doubt. The silver panic, the market shocks, the fractured alliances, all were corrections imposed by reality after years of strategic neglect. What was lost was not just money or influence, but credibility. Credibility is the hardest asset to rebuild because it depends on trust, and trust depends on consistency between words and capacity. Once exposed, weakness invites pressure. Once denial becomes policy, recovery becomes far more painful. The final lesson is the oldest one in strategy. Power rests on truth. Nations fail not when they are challenged, but when they refuse to see themselves clearly. The West did not forget how to compete. It forgot how to be honest. And in that forgetting, it manufactured its own crisis.